Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we embark on a journey unlike any other. A journey not through enchanted castles or mythical realms of gods and monsters, but through the dust of ages and the echoes of marching feet. We travel to a world of marble and blood, of senators and slaves, of legions marching toward horizons they would never reach. Get cozy, settle in, let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders like a heavy cloak. Breathe deeply, and let us begin. Before Rome was an empire, before it was a republic, before it was even a city of brick and stone, it was an idea, a seed planted in the darkness of prehistory, watered by the blood of exiles and the milk of a wolf. Our story begins not on the 7 hills of Latium, but far away, across the wine-dark sea that Homer sang of. It begins in flames. The great city of Troy had fallen. For 10 years, the Greeks had pressed against its walls, and on the final night, they came not through bravery but through cunning, hidden in the belly of a wooden horse. The palaces burned, the towers crumbled, the streets ran red with the blood of Priam's children. But one man escaped. His name was Aeneas. He was no common soldier, but the son of Venus herself, the goddess of love and beauty. And on that night of fire and death, he carried his aged father Anchises upon his back, and led his young son Ascanius by the hand. Behind them, the city of his birth collapsed into ash and memory. For 7 long years, Aeneas and his band of survivors sailed the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. They faced storms sent by Juno, who nursed an ancient grudge against the Trojans. They fled the grasp of the Harpies and the Cyclops. They lost loved ones to sickness and the sword. They buried their dead on foreign shores and continued onward, driven not by maps or certainties, but by prophecy. For the gods had spoken, Aeneas would found a city, and from that city would rise a people destined to rule the world. When at last they sighted the coast of Italy, the Tiber River flowing gently into the sea, the survivors wept. They had arrived. This was the land promised to them. Forested hills, fertile valleys, a river that sparkled under the Italian sun. Aeneas did not live to see the city that would bear his legacy. He fought wars against the native tribes, forged alliances with kings, and planted the seeds of Roman virtue in the soul of his son. But he died, as all men must, and was gathered to the gods from whom he came. Generations passed. The bloodline of Aeneas endured, but the city of prophecy remained unbuilt, a promise waiting centuries to be fulfilled. And then, twins were born. Their mother was Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin and princess of the Latin city of Alba Longa. Their father was Mars, the god of war. And when the usurper King Amulius learned of their birth, he saw only threat. He ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber, their bodies cast into the swift current like refuse. But the Tiber, that gentle brown river, refused to take them. The basket carrying the twins caught in the roots of a wild fig tree, cradled there by the receding waters. A she-wolf, drawn by their cries, came down from the surrounding hills to investigate. She did not devour them. Instead, she curled her warm body around their tiny forms and let them nurse at her teats. A woodpecker, sacred to Mars, brought them berries. Thus were Romulus and Remus saved. A shepherd named Faustulus found them beneath the fig tree, nestled against the wolf who had become their mother. He carried them home to his wife, and they raised the twins as their own. The boys grew tall and fierce, hunters of deer and boar, protectors of the flock, leaders of the shepherd bands that roamed the Palatine and Aventine hills. In time, they learned their true lineage. They cast down the usurper Amulius and restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa. But they did not stay. The hills where the wolf had found. In time, they learned their true lineage. They cast down the usurper Amulius and restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa. But they did not stay. The hills where the wolf had found them called to their blood. And so they returned to the Tiber, to the place of their salvation, to build a city of their own. But the question of where and in whose name drove a wedge between them. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, with its gentle slopes and clear view of the river. Remus preferred the Aventine, greener and wilder. They agreed to let the gods decide through augury, the ancient art of reading the will of heaven through the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures first. Romulus saw 12. They argued. Their followers argued. And in the heat of that dispute, Romulus began to dig the foundations of his city on the Palatine, marking the sacred boundary with a plow, the furrow that would become the wall. Remus, mocking the low height of the rising barrier, leapt over it. And Romulus, his brother, his twin, the other half of his soul, struck him down. So dies the first blood spilled in the name of Rome. Romulus stood over the body of his brother, and the weight of what he had done settled into his bones. But he did not stop digging. He did not stop building. He declared the city open to all who sought refuge: runaways, debtors, criminals, the displaced, and the desperate. He filled its empty streets with men who had no other home. But men alone do not make a people. So Romulus invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, and there his followers carried off their daughters. It was a brutal beginning, a crime that would stain the city's memory forever. Yet from that violence came union. The Sabine king Titus Tatius marched on Rome, and the Sabine women, who had been given Roman husbands, threw themselves between the armies and begged for peace. And so the two peoples merged. Romulus ruled beside Tatius. The seeds of Rome were planted in soil soaked with blood and watered with tears. For 40 years, Romulus reigned. He established the Senate, 100 elder statesmen whose advice would guide the kings. He organized the army into legions. He conquered the surrounding towns and brought their people into the growing fold of Roman citizenship. When at last a storm gathered on the field of Mars, and he disappeared into the clouds, the people did not believe he had died. They believed he had ascended, that Mars had taken his son home. And for centuries, Romans would whisper that their founder still watched over them, waiting in the halls of the gods for the day his city would need him again. After Romulus vanished into the thunderclouds, the Romans faced an unsettling question. They had a senate, they had an army, they had citizens and laws and households. But they had no king. The senators, each man of noble birth and considerable ambition, attempted to rule collectively. For a year, they governed in rotation, passing the symbols of royal authority between them like a hot coal no one wished to hold too long. But the people grew restless. The neighboring tribes, smelling weakness, pressed against Rome's borders. The city needed one leader, one voice, one sword. They elected Numa Pompilius. Numa was no warrior. He was a Sabine, a man of peace and profound piety, and when the Senate offered him the crown, he did not leap to accept it. He asked for divine confirmation. He asked the gods, through augury, whether they wished him to rule. The heavens answered, and so Numa came to Rome. His reign transformed the city from a camp of warriors into a sanctuary of law and worship. He built the Temple of Janus, whose doors would stand open in times of war and closed in times of peace. During his 43 years as king, those doors never opened. He established the Vestal Virgins to guard the sacred flame, the priesthoods that would interpret the will of the gods, and the calendar that marked the rhythms of Roman religious life. Numa taught the Wolf children's descendants that a city could be bound not only by conquest, but by covenant, not only by steel, but by ceremony. When he died, he did not vanish in storms or ascend on eagle's wings. He aged, as men do, and was buried on the Janiculum Hill. But his books of sacred law were entombed beside him, and Romans would speak his name with reverence for 1,000 years. Tullus Hostilius followed, and he was Numa's opposite in every way. Where Numa sought peace, Tullus craved war. He expanded Roman territory through the destruction of Alba Longa, the mother city from which Romulus and Remus had come. He fought the Sabines and the Latins and the Etruscans. He doubled the population of Rome and built the Senate house that would bear his name, the Curia Hostilia, where generations of senators would argue, conspire, and condemn. And yet the gods do not forget those who neglect them. A plague descended upon Rome. Tullus, who had allowed the sacred rituals to languish, begged Jupiter for aid. The king of gods answered, with a bolt of lightning that consumed Tullus and his house entirely. Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa, attempted to restore the balance between peace and war. He built the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, connecting Rome to the lands beyond. He founded the port of Ostia at the river's mouth, giving Rome its window to the sea. He fought when he must and prayed when he could. And then came Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Tarquin the Elder. Tarquin was not Roman by birth. He was Etruscan, a wealthy immigrant from the north, and he arrived in Rome with his wife Tanaquil, a prophetess who saw greatness in her husband's future. Legend says that as they approached the city gates, an eagle descended, lifted Tarquin's cap from his head, carried it high into the air, and then gently replaced it upon his brow. Tanaquil understood. The heavens had crowned him. Tarquin rose swiftly through Roman society. His wealth purchased influence, his charm won allies. When Ancus Marcius died, Tarquin persuaded the people to elect him king. He waged war against the Latins and Sabines and returned to Rome with wagons piled high with spoils. He built the great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, that drained the marshy valleys between the hills and made the Forum Romanum possible. He laid the foundations for the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a project so ambitious that his grandson would complete it. But kingship, once seized, becomes a habit, and habits are difficult to break. The sons of Ancus Marcius had expected to inherit their father's throne. When Tarquin claimed it instead, their resentment festered in the shadows. They hired assassins, and one day, pretending to seek arbitration over a petty dispute, they struck Tarquin down at the palace door. The axe blow was not immediately fatal, but the king staggered, bleeding, into the arms of his guards. Tanaquil did not wail or weep. She ordered the palace gates sealed, announced that the king was wounded but recovering, and sent word to her son-in-law Servius Tullius that he must act swiftly. Servius Tullius was another child of prophecy, said to have been born of a slave woman and a flame that appeared in the royal hearth. Tanaquil had raised him as her own, and now, as Tarquin lay dying, she thrust the royal power into Servius's hands. He was the first king to rule without election, the first to rely not on the will of the people, but on the cunning of a queen. and yet he proved a remarkable ruler. Servius Tullius expanded the city walls to encompass the Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal hills. He reformed the army, organizing citizens not by birth but by wealth, creating the centuries that would shape Roman politics for half a millennium. He built the Temple of Diana on the Aventine as a sanctuary for all Latins, a symbol of Rome's growing hegemony. But his own family destroyed him. His daughter Tullia, ambitious and ruthless, married Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, son of the murdered king. Together, they conspired against Servius. Tarquin marched into the Senate house and hurled the aged king down the steps into the street. Tullia drove her chariot over her father's body, splattering her dress with his blood. Thus ended the line of the 7 kings. Tarquin the Proud ruled as a tyrant. He ignored the Senate. He condemned his political enemies without trial. He treated Rome as his personal property, and his son Sextus Tarquinius committed an act of such monstrous violation that it shattered the throne forever. Her name was Lucretia. She was the wife of Collatinus, a nobleman, and she was famed for her virtue. Sextus came to her home as a guest and left as a rapist. The next morning, Lucretia summoned her father and her husband, told them what had been done to her, and drove a dagger into her own heart. She bled out on the stones of her house, and in that blood, an old order died with her. Lucius Junius Brutus, the nephew of Tarquin, the fool who had pretended idiocy to escape his uncle's suspicion, drew the dagger from Lucretia's breast and swore an oath before her still warm body. Not Tarquin, not any king, never again. He raised the standard of rebellion. The gates of Rome swung open, but not to welcome the king home. They swung open to cast him out. Tarquin the Proud fled to Etruria to seek aid from his fellow tyrants. And the Romans, standing in the forum where their ancestors had traded cattle and argued over boundary stones, looked at the empty throne and made a choice. They would not fill it. The Republic was born not in triumph, but in terror. Tarquin the Proud, exiled and furious, did not accept his fate. He journeyed north to the Etruscan city of Clusium, where King Lars Porsena ruled with an army vast enough to swallow Rome whole. Porsena listened to Tarquin's pleas. He saw opportunity, a chance to humble this upstart Latin city that dared to call itself free. He gathered his warriors and marched south. Rome had no king now. It had 2 consuls, elected annually, sharing power so that no single man could seize it. The first of these were Brutus himself and Collatinus, Lucretia's widower. They commanded citizen soldiers, farmers who left their plows in the earth and picked up swords, merchants who exchanged scales for shields. Porsena's army arrived at the Janiculum Hill, across the Tiber. The Romans retreated before the Etruscan advance, falling back across the Pons Sublicius, the wooden bridge that was their only crossing. If the bridge fell, so would Rome. A young soldier named Publius Horatius Cockle stood at the head of that bridge and looked at the Etruscan host spreading across the far bank. He turned to the men behind him. "Cut the bridge," he said, "with axe and fire. I will hold them here." 2 companions, Spurius Lartius and Titus Herminius, stood with him. Together, 3 Romans faced an army. The Etruscans advanced. Horatius and his companions struck down the first wave, then the second. Spears clattered against shields. Swords sang in the morning light. Behind them, the bridge groaned as Roman engineers hacked at its timbers. "Hurry," Horatius called. Lartius fell, wounded. Herminius dragged him to safety. The bridge shuddered, weakened, began to crumble into the Tiber. And still Horatius stood alone. A final Etruscan spear pierced his shield, lodged in his flesh. He did not retreat. He did not fall. When the bridge collapsed behind him in a cascade of wood and water, Horatius turned and, still in full armor, leapt into the river. The Tiber received him. Currents dragged him under, battered him against stones, stole the breath from his lungs. But the same river that had cradled Romulus and Remus now carried Horatius to the Roman bank, where his countrymen pulled him from the water. Porsenna could not cross. He besieged the city, but another hero rose to meet him. Gaius Mucius Cordova, a young nobleman, volunteered to assassinate the Etruscan king. He infiltrated Porsenna's camp, but in the crowded chaos of the royal pavilion, he stabbed the wrong man, the king's treasurer, resplendent in purple robes. Captured, dragged before Porsenna, Mucius showed no fear. "I am a Roman citizen," he said. "My name is Gaius Mucius. I came to kill you, and I failed. But there are 300 of us who have sworn the same oath. Watch." He thrust his right hand into the altar fire and held it there, without flinching, until the flesh blackened and the bones shone through. Porsenna, astonished and unnerved, ordered the young man released. "Go," he said. "You have harmed yourself more than you have harmed me." "Since you honor courage," Mucius replied, "I will tell you a truth. We are 300. But now you understand what kind of men we are." Porsenna lifted the siege. Tarquin the Proud would never sit on the Roman throne again. The Republic endured, but it was a fragile thing, this experiment in liberty. Within its first years, Brutus himself condemned his own sons to death for conspiring to restore the Tarquins. He watched them bound to the stake, beaten with rods, beheaded, and his face, the historians say, showed no emotion. This was the terrible gravity of Roman liberty. It required constant sacrifice, constant vigilance. The Republic was not a gift. It was a burden. For 2 centuries, that burden shaped every aspect of Roman life. The patricians, the old noble families, claimed exclusive access to power. They alone could hold the highest offices, interpret the laws, conduct the sacred rituals that ensured divine favor. The plebeians, the common people, tilled the fields, fought the wars, paid the taxes, and had no voice in how any of it was governed. Again and again, the plebeians withdrew. They marched out of the city to the sacred mount, refusing to work or fight until their grievances were heard. These secessions forced the patricians to concede. First came the tribunes of the plebs, sacred officers whose very persons were inviolable, who could veto any act of the magistrates. Then came the 12 tables, Rome's first written law, inscribed on bronze and posted in the Forum so that no judge could twist justice through secret interpretation. Slowly, incrementally, the Republic expanded its definition of who counted as a citizen, who deserved a voice. And it expanded its borders. Year after year, the legions marched. They defeated the Latins and absorbed them. They defeated the Samnites after 3 brutal wars, subjugating the fierce mountain tribes of central Italy. They defeated the Greek cities of the south, including Tarentum, which summoned King Pyrrhus of Epirus to their aid. Pyrrhus came with elephants, beasts the Romans had never seen. He won battles, at Heraclea, at Asculum. But his losses were so devastating that he reportedly said, "Another such victory, and I am ruined." Thus the phrase, Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhus returned to Greece, defeated and disillusioned. By 270 BCE, all of Italy south of the Po Valley was Roman. Not conquered provinces, not subject kingdoms, but allies, Municipia, communities bound to Rome by treaties that granted different levels of rights and responsibilities. It was an empire already. They simply had not yet realized it. But across the narrow sea, in North Africa, a power watched Rome's rise with growing unease. Carthage, merchant queen of the Mediterranean, heir to Tyre and Sidon, mistress of the waves. For centuries, Rome and Carthage had traded, coexisted, treated each other as distant neighbors separated by water and mutual disinterest. That was about to change. The First Punic War began over a triviality, a request for aid from a band of Italian mercenaries who had seized the Sicilian city of Messana. Rome, reluctant but bound by treaty obligations, sent a small force across the straits. Carthage, which had long dominated Sicily, responded in force. 23 years later, the war ended. Rome had lost hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, an entire fleet to storms off the coast of Camarina. But they had won. Sicily became Rome's first province. Sardinia and Corsica soon followed, and a Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca, defeated but unbroken, withdrew to Spain to rebuild. He brought with him his 9-year-old son, a boy with dark curls and burning eyes, who made his father swear an oath before the household gods. "I swear," the boy said, "that as soon as I am able, I will be an enemy to the Roman people." His name was Hannibal. 17 years later, he marched. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca assembled his army at New Carthage. He had 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, the armored tanks of the ancient world. His goal was not to defend Carthage. His goal was to destroy Rome, and he would not cross the sea to do it. He would cross the mountains. The march from Spain to Italy covered nearly 1,000 miles. Hannibal fought his way through hostile tribes, crossed the Pyrenees, traversed southern Gaul. The Roman army, expecting him to sail, scrambled north to intercept him. But Hannibal had already vanished into the Alps. The Alps in autumn were treacherous. Narrow passes, sheer cliffs, early snows that buried the trails. Men slipped and fell into chasms. Pack animals starved. The elephants, terrified of the heights, trumpeted in panic and had to be coaxed along treacherously narrow paths. By the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, he had lost half his army. He still had 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of elephants. And he had the element of utter, devastating surprise. The Romans sent army after army against him. Hannibal destroyed them all. At Trebia, he concealed his brother Mago with a picked force in the reeds along the riverbank. When the Romans crossed, freezing and exhausted, Mago struck their rear. At Lake Trasimene, Hannibal trapped 4 legions against the water and slaughtered them to a man. The consul Flaminius fell without ever understanding how he had been outmaneuvered. Rome panicked. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, and Fabius adopted a strategy of avoidance. Shadow Hannibal, harass his foragers, refuse pitched battle. The Romans called him Cunctator, the delayer. They mocked him. They demanded action. And in 216 BCE, they got it. The battlefield was at Cannae, in southeastern Italy. Rome fielded its largest army in history, 86,000 men, packed densely in the traditional formation. Hannibal had perhaps 50,000, many of them Gauls and Spaniards of questionable reliability. The Roman commander, Varro, expected to crush the Carthaginian center through sheer weight. Hannibal expected him to try. The Carthaginian line formed a crescent, its center deliberately weak, its wings composed of veteran African infantry. As the Romans pressed forward, the crescent bent, then bowed, then curved inward. The African wings swung forward, encircling the Roman mass. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry swept around and struck the rear. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. 50,000 Roman soldiers died that afternoon, their bodies piled so thick that Hannibal reportedly filled 3 bushels of gold rings stripped from the fingers of dead senators. Kenny became the template for the perfect victory. For 2,000 years, military academies would study Hannibal's tactics. But that night, camped among the dead, Hannibal received no congratulations from his officers. He had destroyed 8 legions. He had killed 2 consuls, 80 senators, and enough Roman manpower to staff a small city. And still Rome refused to surrender. The Senate thanked Fabius for not despairing. They refused to ransom the prisoners Hannibal offered for sale. They raised new legions from boys of 17 and veterans of 60. They armed their slaves and debtors. They forbade the word peace to be spoken within the city walls. Hannibal marched across Italy for 15 years, winning battles, capturing cities, building alliances with Rome's disaffected allies. But he never received the reinforcements he begged from Carthage. He never breached Rome's walls. He never broke Rome's will. Publius Cornelius Scipio was 24 years old when he volunteered to take command of Roman forces in Spain. He was the son of a consul killed by Hannibal, the nephew of another consul killed by Hannibal. He had survived Cannae by sheer luck, and he burned with a cold, patient fire. In 4 years, Scipio conquered all of Spain. He captured New Carthage, trained his army in Hannibal's own tactics, and built a base from which to strike at Carthage itself. In 204 BCE, he sailed for Africa. The Senate recalled Hannibal. After 36 years abroad, he returned to defend his home. They met at Zama in 202 BCE. Scipio's legions, hardened by years of campaigning, faced Hannibal's veterans, exhausted by the long voyage, depleted by years of attrition. The elephants charged and Scipio's infantry opened lanes, letting them pass through to be slaughtered in the rear. The cavalry battle favored Rome, and when Scipio's final reserves struck the Carthaginian rear, Hannibal knew he was beaten. He escaped the battlefield. He spent the rest of his life in exile, advising the enemies of Rome, never ceasing to be an enemy to the Roman people. Scipio returned home in triumph, granted the surname Africanus for the continent he had conquered. Carthage survived, stripped of its empire, its navy, its pride. 50 years later, Rome grew tired of even that. In 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Africanus, breached Carthage's walls. The siege lasted 3 years, and when it ended, the Romans systematically destroyed the city. They burned every building, leveled every wall, plowed salt into the soil so that nothing would ever grow there again. Legend says Scipio wept as he watched Carthage burn. He quoted Homer's Hector, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." He knew that what Rome had done to Carthage, someday someone would do to Rome. The destruction of Carthage marked a turning point. Rome had no rivals left in the Mediterranean. Macedonia had fallen. Greece had been subjugated. The Seleucid Empire had been humbled. The legions brought wealth pouring into Italy, but that wealth flowed upward, not outward. The great landowners, the senatorial aristocracy, grew fabulously rich. They purchased vast estates, worked by slaves captured in Rome's endless wars. Small farmers, the backbone of the Roman legions, could not compete. They sold their plots and drifted to the city, joining a growing class of landless poor who crammed into tenements and survived on public grain. The Roman army had always been a militia of property owners. Now the property owners were disappearing. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was 30 years old when he stood for the tribunate. He came from one of Rome's most distinguished families. His father had been consul. His mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus. He had every reason to defend the existing order. Instead, he proposed to overturn it. His land reform bill limited the amount of public land any individual could hold and redistributed the surplus to poor citizens. The Senate resisted. They persuaded another tribune, Marcus Octavius, to veto the bill. Tiberius, breaking all precedent, had Octavius removed from office. The bill passed. The redistribution began, but Tiberius had made enemies. When he stood for re-election, another unprecedented act, his opponents accused him of seeking kingship. On election day, a mob of senators and their clients stormed the Capitoline Assembly. Tiberius was beaten to death with a wooden bench leg. 300 of his supporters were slaughtered in the ensuing riot. His body was thrown into the Tiber. The Senate hoped that would be the end of it. 10 years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus took up the cause. He was more radical than Tiberius. He proposed citizenship for Rome's Italian allies, stable grain prices for the poor, colonies for landless veterans, and the transfer of jury courts from the Senate to the equestrian class. He was re-elected tribune twice, an unprecedented display of popular support. And in 121 BCE, the Senate passed its ultimate weapon, the final decree, Consul videat any quid residential publica detrimenti capiat. Let the consul see that the republic suffer no harm. Lucius Opimius, the consul, interpreted this decree as authorization to kill Gaius Gracchus and his followers without trial. Gaius fled to the grove of Farina, where he ordered his slave to cut his throat. His head was brought to Opimius, who paid its weight in gold. The bodies of 3,000 citizens were thrown into the Tiber. Rome had killed its reformers, but the problems they had tried to solve did not die with them. The Italian allies, denied citizenship, grew increasingly restive. In 91 BCE, they rose in revolt. The social war, from socii, allies, lasted 3 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Rome eventually won by granting citizenship to any Italian who laid down arms. The peninsula was finally unified, but the cost in blood and trust was incalculable, and the legions had changed. No longer militia farmers. They were now professional soldiers who owed their loyalty not to the abstract republic, but to the generals who led them, paid them, and promised them land upon retirement. Gaius Marius, 7 times consul, had reformed the army to defeat the Germanic tribes threatening Italy's northern frontier. He opened the legions to the landless poor, equipped them at state expense, and trained them to a professional standard. He also created the first client army, men whose loyalty was to Marius, not to Rome. Marius's rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician of impeccable pedigree and ruthless ambition. When the Senate gave Sulla command of the war against Mithridates, king of Pontus, Marius persuaded the popular assembly to transfer the command to himself. Sulla did not accept this reversal. He marched his 6 legions on Rome itself, an act of unprecedented treason. For the first time in 400 years, a Roman army entered the sacred city not in triumph, but in conquest. Sulla seized power, had Marius declared an outlaw, and sailed east to fight Mithridates. Marius returned, raised an army of his own, and recaptured Rome in a bloody counter-coup. He died 17 days into his 7th consulship, delirious with fever and convinced he was commanding phantom legions. Sulla finished his war, concluded a favorable peace with Mithridates, and returned to Italy. He landed at Brundisium with 40,000 veteran soldiers and began the slow, systematic reconquest of his homeland. The civil war lasted another year. At the Colline Gate, Sulla's army broke the last Samnite resistance. He had himself declared dictator, not for 6 months, as the ancient office allowed, but for as long as he deemed necessary. The proscriptions began. Sulla posted lists of his enemies in the forum. Any man whose name appeared could be killed on sight. His property was confiscated, his children disinherited. Thousands died. The heads of the proscribed were displayed on the rostra, that ancient speaker's platform worn smooth by generations of orators. Sulla reformed the state, strengthening the Senate, curbing the power of the tribunes, and attempting to restore the aristocratic republic he had spent his career destroying. Then, in an act of even greater astonishment, he abdicated. He retired to his country estate, wrote his memoirs, and died of a parasitic infection contracted from unsanitary drinking water. He was given the largest funeral in Roman history, but the precedent he had set could not be undone. A Roman general with a loyal army had discovered that he could seize Rome itself. Others would remember. The generation after Sulla's death produced 3 men who would dominate Roman politics through ambition, brilliance, and mutual suspicion. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was Sulla's former lieutenant, a man who had earned his cognomen by age 25 through victories in Africa and Spain. He had celebrated 2 triumphs before he was legally old enough to hold the consulship. He was the most powerful man in Rome, and he knew it. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome, having amassed a fortune through real estate speculation, mining, and the judicious acquisition of prescribed estates. He had defeated Spartacus's slave revolt and crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way. He wanted military glory to match his wealth. Gaius Julius Caesar was the wild card. He came from an ancient but impoverished patrician family, had survived Sulla's proscriptions by refusing to divorce his wife, and had built a reputation as a dandy, a womanizer, and a dangerously skillful orator. He was deeply in debt and deeply ambitious. In 60 BCE, these 3 formed a private pact, the First Triumvirate. Pompey got land for his veterans. Crassus got favorable tax contracts for his business allies. Caesar got the consulship, followed by command of Gaul. Gaul changed everything. For 8 years, Caesar waged a brutal, methodical campaign of conquest. He defeated the Helvetii, crushed the Belgic tribes, twice invaded Britain, and annihilated a German invasion force. He built a reputation as Rome's greatest general since Scipio Africanus. His legions adored him. His dispatches to the Senate were masterpieces of propaganda, casting his aggressive warfare as defensive necessity. And all the while, the triumvirate crumbled. Crassus, desperate for his own military glory, invaded Parthia. At Carrhae, the Parthian cavalry surrounded his legions and slaughtered them. Crassus was captured and executed by having molten gold poured down his throat, a sardonic commentary on his legendary greed. With Crassus dead, the balance shattered. Pompey, increasingly jealous of Caesar's success, aligned himself with the Senate. In 49 BCE, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar did not disband his army. On the night of January 10th, he stood with his 13th legion on the banks of the Rubicon, the small river that marked the boundary of his lawful command. To cross with armed forces was treason, war against the Republic. He hesitated. The historians say he stood in the darkness for a long time, weighing his life in his hands. Then he said, "Alia iacta est." The die is cast. He crossed. Pompey fled to Greece. Caesar swept through Italy in 60 days, entered Rome unopposed, and secured his rear by defeating Pompey's legions in Spain. Then he sailed east. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, the two armies met. Pompey commanded twice as many men, but Caesar's veterans were hardened by a decade of war. They broke Pompey's center, and the great man fled, first to Egypt, then to the executioner's blade. Pompey died on a beach at Alexandria, betrayed by the boy king who hoped to curry Caesar's favor. Caesar arrived in Egypt to find his rival's severed head presented as a gift. He wept. He ordered Pompey's signet ring recovered and his killers punished. Then he stayed. In Alexandria, he met Cleopatra, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, brilliant, ambitious, and 21 years old. She had herself smuggled to him rolled in a carpet. By morning, she was his lover. By the end of the year, she had given birth to his son. Caesar defeated her rivals, restored her to the throne, and spent several months sailing the Nile with her. When he finally returned to Rome, he brought Cleopatra and their son with him. The scandal was immense. The implication was unmistakable. In 4 years, Caesar reformed the Roman state more thoroughly than anyone since the mythical kings. He reformed the calendar, giving us the system of leap years that would serve Europe for 16 centuries. He expanded the Senate to include provincials and Gauls, breaking the old aristocracy's monopoly on power. He initiated vast building projects, public works programs, colonies for his veterans. He was granted the dictatorship, first for 10 years, then for life. He was also granted the right to wear triumphal regalia whenever he chose, to sit on the golden chair of the kings, to have his statue placed in the temples of the gods. The Senate he had expanded now competed to shower him with unprecedented honors. Some of them genuinely revered him. Others were waiting for the right moment. Marcus Junius Brutus traced his ancestry to Lucius Junius Brutus, who had sworn to abolish kingship 4.5 centuries earlier. His mother had been Caesar's mistress. Caesar had pardoned him after Pharsalus, promoted him, treated him almost as a son. The rumor was that Brutus was Caesar's natural son. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, Brutus joined a conspiracy of 60 senators. They concealed daggers in their togas and gathered in the portico of Pompey, where Caesar would preside over a meeting of the Senate. Caesar hesitated at the door. Someone handed him a scroll, warning of conspiracy. He did not read it. As he took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him. One of them, Tilius Cimber, approached as if to present a petition, grabbed Caesar's purple toga, and pulled it from his shoulders. The signal, Publius Servilius Casca, struck first, a clumsy blow to the neck. Caesar seized Casca's arm and drove his stylus through it. Then the others closed in. He saw Brutus among the faces, the blades. According to tradition, he said, "Et tu, Brute? Then you, Brutus?" Then he covered his face with his toga and collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue. 23 wounds. One, the physicians said, would have been fatal. The conspirators fled through the streets, shouting that they had killed a tyrant, that liberty was restored. They expected the people to rejoice. Instead, Rome panicked. Caesar's body was carried through the Forum, displaying the wounds. Mark Antony, his colleague as consul and his most loyal lieutenant, delivered a eulogy so masterfully inflammatory that the mob rioted, hunted down the conspirators, and burned the Senate house to the ground as Caesar's funeral pyre. Civil war resumed. Within 3 years, Brutus and Cassius, defeated at Philippi, had fallen on their own swords. Within 13 years, Mark Antony, Caesar's heir, had been defeated by Caesar's adopted son. His name was Gaius Octavius. History remembers him as Augustus. Octavian was 18 years old when he learned that he was Caesar's adopted son and principal heir. He was a sickly youth, untested in war, unknown to the legions. Mark Antony dismissed him as a boy who owed everything to a name. He was wrong. Octavian allied with Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus in a second triumvirate, this one formally sanctioned by law. They proscribed their enemies more systematically than Sulla had. 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians died, their property funding the war against Caesar's assassins. Cicero, the greatest orator of the age, was hunted down and killed on Antony's orders. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra, where generations of Romans had heard him speak. After Philippi, the triumvirs divided the Roman world. Lepidus took Africa. Antony took the east, where he renewed Caesar's liaison with Cleopatra and gradually transformed himself into a Hellenistic monarch. Octavian took the west, where he patiently consolidated power, settled veterans, and cultivated the image of Rome's traditional defender. The final breach came in 32 BCE. Antony divorced Octavian's sister Octavia, a public humiliation, and formally recognized Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, as Caesar's legitimate heir. Octavian responded not by declaring war on Antony, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen who had seduced a Roman general and threatened the Republic itself. They met at sea, off the promontory of Actium. Agrippa, Octavian's brilliant admiral, outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. Cleopatra's squadron fled. Antony followed her. His army, abandoned by their commander, surrendered. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, believing she had betrayed him, then learning she had not. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, took her own life by poison, the famous SP, though the exact method remains uncertain. Caesarion was hunted down and executed. Egypt became a Roman province, its vast grain wealth flowing directly to Octavian's treasury. Octavian returned to Rome. He was 33 years old, master of the entire Mediterranean world, and his problem was what to do with his victory. He did not wish to be king. Kingship was associated with tyranny, with Tarquin, with the arrogance that invited assassination. His adoptive father had learned that lesson in blood. But he could not simply restore the old republic. That system had collapsed under its own contradictions, and restoring it would only invite new civil wars. So Octavian created something new, and pretended it was old. On January 13th, 27 BCE, he stood before the Senate and solemnly transferred his extraordinary powers back to the Roman people. He was, he said, restoring the Republic. The Senate, carefully prepared, responded not by accepting his resignation, but by begging him to continue guiding the state. They granted him the name Augustus, the revered one, the exalted. They gave him command of the provinces containing most of the legions, Gaul, Spain, Syria. They gave him the tribunician power, which allowed him to propose legislation and veto the acts of others. They gave him supreme authority, carefully avoiding the word that would have damned him. He was not a king. He was the first citizen, the princeps. The republic had been restored. The Senate still met. The magistrates were still elected. The provinces were still governed according to law. But everyone understood. For 41 years, Augustus ruled. He reformed every aspect of Roman life. The army, now a permanent professional force stationed at the frontiers. The treasury, funded by new taxes collected by imperial officials. The city, transformed from brick to marble through an unprecedented building program. He expanded the empire to its natural boundaries: the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, the Sahara. Only Germany eluded him. 3 legions were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE, and Augustus, it is said, spent months wandering his palace, crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." He built a new political system, but he could not solve its fundamental problem: succession. A monarchy requires an heir. The old republic had elected its magistrates annually. The new principate needed to transfer supreme power from one man to another without lapsing into civil war. Augustus tried everything. He married his daughter to his general Agrippa, who died. He adopted Agrippa's sons, who died. He promoted his stepson Tiberius, reluctantly, and was still reluctant when he finally died in 14 CE, at the age of 75. His wife Livia had kept him alive, the historians say, through careful attention to his diet and health. They also said she hastened his end with poisoned figs. Neither claim can be proven. Both reflect the anxiety of a system that placed absolute power in the hands of one man and hoped for the best. Tiberius succeeded him without crisis. He was a capable administrator who hated the job and spent his final years in self-imposed exile on Capri, leaving the government to his praetorian prefect, Sejanus, who used his power to eliminate rivals, consolidate his position, and eventually be eliminated himself when Tiberius realized he had created a monster. After Tiberius came Caligula, the beloved son of Germanicus, who began as a popular young prince and devolved into a depraved tyrant, or was driven mad by illness, or was simply misrepresented by senators who despised him. He was assassinated after 4 years, his guard commander Cassius Chaerea personally avenging the emperor's mockery. After Caligula came Claudius, the stuttering scholar whom everyone had overlooked. He proved an unexpectedly capable administrator, conquering Britain, reforming the bureaucracy, building the great harbor at Ostia. His 4th wife, Agrippina, murdered him with poisoned mushrooms to secure the succession for her son Nero. And Nero, who began his reign with promises of enlightened rule, degenerated into theatrical obsession and murderous paranoia. He killed his mother, his wife, his tutor Seneca. When fire destroyed much of Rome in 64 CE, he blamed the Christians and began the first imperial persecution. When the Senate finally declared him a public enemy, he fled and committed suicide, allegedly gasping, "What an artist dies with me." The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended as it had begun, in blood. But the system Augustus built survived. A year of civil war produced 3 short-lived emperors, and then the 4th, Vespasian, seized control. He was a blunt, practical soldier from the Italian municipal aristocracy, and his first act was to laugh. "I think I'm becoming a god," he said on his deathbed. His dynasty, the Flavians, built the Colosseum, pacified Judea after the Great Revolt, and demonstrated that emperors could come from outside the old nobility. Vespasian's son Titus opened the Flavian amphitheater with 100 days of games. His younger son Domitian ruled as an autocrat and was assassinated in a palace conspiracy. The Senate celebrated Domitian's death. Nerva, an elderly senator, became emperor. He adopted Trajan, a Spanish-born general, as his successor. Thus began the period that Edward Gibbon would call the most happy and prosperous in human history. For nearly a century, from 96 to 180 CE, the empire was ruled by 5 men of extraordinary competence: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. They were not related by blood. Each chose the best candidate for the job. Rome reached its greatest extent under Trajan: Dacia, Mesopotamia, Armenia. Hadrian, less expansionist, consolidated the borders and built his famous wall across Britain. Antoninus Pius presided over 2 decades of peace and prosperity so uneventful that historians struggle to fill the pages. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, spent his reign defending the frontiers against Germanic tribes and Parthian armies, writing his meditations in campaign tents by candlelight. But Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern. He was succeeded by his son Commodus, who fought as a gladiator, renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, and was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus. The Golden Age was over. Commodus fell on New Year's Eve, 192 CE. Within 90 days, for men had claimed the purple. The civil wars that followed established a new dynasty, the Severans, and a new reality. The empire was no longer governed by the traditional aristocracy of Italy, but by generals from the provinces. Septimius Severus, who emerged victorious, was a North African who spoke Latin with a Punic accent. He increased the soldiers' pay, married a Syrian priestess, and died at York while campaigning in Britain. Enriched the soldiers, he told his sons from his deathbed, and scorned all other men. His son Caracalla murdered his brother Geta and ordered a damnatio memoriae, so thorough that Geta's face was chiseled from every portrait in the empire. Caracalla extended Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire, not out of generosity, but to expand the tax base. He was assassinated on the road to Carrhae, victim of his own Praetorian prefect. The dynasty collapsed into the usual pattern of usurpation, civil war, and murder. Elagabalus, the 14-year-old priest-emperor from Syria, scandalized Rome with his eccentricities and was assassinated by the Praetorians. His cousin Severus Alexander ruled moderately for 13 years and was murdered by his own soldiers for attempting to negotiate with German invaders. And then the empire shattered. The 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, historians called a crisis. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Between 20 and 50 men claimed the throne, depending on how one counts usurpers. Most reigned for months, some for weeks. Few died of natural causes. The frontiers collapsed on every side. The Goths crossed the Danube, sacked Athens, and looted the Aegean coast. The Franks and Alemanni breached the Rhine and penetrated as far as Spain. The Sasanian Persians, a new and aggressive dynasty, captured the Emperor Valerian in battle and kept him as a footstool for the rest of his life. The economy hyperinflated. The silver denarius, once the empire's stable currency, became a bronze coin washed with silver, then a bronze coin with a silver wash, then a bronze coin with the vague memory of silver. Cities shrank. Trade routes faltered. The great aristocratic villas began to wall themselves. plague swept through the population. The Antonine Plague had killed perhaps 5 million under Marcus Aurelius. The Cyprian Plague, 3 generations later, may have been even worse. And yet the empire did not die. It was saved by a series of soldier emperors from the Illyrian provinces, modern Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria. Claudius Gothicus defeated the Goths at Nisus. Aurelian reconquered the breakaway Gallic and Palmyrene empires and built the great walls that still surround Rome. Probus planted vineyards on the Rhine and was murdered by his troops for making them work in peacetime. And then Diocletian seized power in 284. He was another Illyrian, the son of a freedman raised through the ranks. He understood that the old system was broken beyond repair. Diocletian did not try to restore the Augustan Principate. He created something new, the Dominate, from Dominus, master. The emperor was no longer princeps, first citizen. He was Lord and God, his subjects prostrate before him in adoration. He wore jeweled robes and a diadem like the Persian kings. He also divided the empire. The task was too great for one man. The frontiers stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates, too vast to be defended from a single capital. Diocletian appointed Maximian as his co-emperor, then added 2 junior Caesars. The Tetrarchy, rule of 4, governed from Nicomedia, Milan, Trier, Antioch. For the next 12 years, Constantine and Licinius circled each other like wary predators. 2 more civil wars followed. In 324, Constantine emerged as sole emperor of a reunited Rome. He immediately began building a new capital. Byzantium, an ancient Greek city on the Bosporus, was transformed into Constantinople, New Rome. It had a senate, 7 hills, 14 regions, public buildings modeled on the originals. It was consecrated in 330, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and Constantine adorned it with Christian churches alongside traditional temples. He was baptized on his deathbed in 337, postponing the sacrament until he could sin no more. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by 12 cenotaphs, the 13th apostle. The empire Constantine reunified would not long remain unified, but his capital would endure for more than 1,000 years. Constantine's sons inherited his empire and immediately began fighting over it. Constantius II emerged as sole emperor in 353 after a decade of civil war, and spent his reign defending the frontiers and promoting Arian Christianity. When he died in 361, the purple passed to his cousin Julian, who had been raised as a Christian but secretly rejected the faith. Julian's reign lasted 20 months, too brief to accomplish his ambitious program of pagan restoration, long enough to earn him the epithet, the apostate. He reopened temples, restored sacrifices, and composed philosophical treatises attacking Christianity. He died on campaign against Persia, reportedly crying, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean." After Julian's death, the empire passed to a series of soldier emperors who upheld Nicene orthodoxy. Theodosius I, the last man to rule both halves of the empire, made Christianity the official state religion. He banned pagan sacrifices, closed the temples, and watched the Olympic Games for the last time in 393. When Theodosius died in 395, he left the empire to his 2 young sons. Arcadius received the east, Honorius received the west. They were teenagers, easily dominated by courtiers and generals. They never cooperated, never even visited each other's capitals. The division became permanent. The West deteriorated rapidly. The Visigoths, driven westward by the Huns, crossed the Danube in 376 and defeated the Eastern Army at Adrianople. They settled in the Balkans, nominally as allies, actually as a semi-independent nation within Roman borders. Their king Alaric led them into Italy in 401. Honorius, sheltered in his impregnable fortress at Ravenna, sent his general Stilicho to deal with the crisis. Stilicho repelled Alaric at Pollentia and Verona, then discovered that eastern troops had been dispatched not to help him, but to seize his province. He was executed in 408 on suspicion of treason. Alaric returned. 3 times he besieged Rome. 3 times he negotiated a settlement, was promised gold and land, and was betrayed. On August 24th, 410, his patience exhausted, he led his army through the Salarian Gate. Rome had not been sacked in 800 years, not since the Gauls crept up the Capitoline under cover of darkness. The Visigoths were not Gauls. They were Christians, Arian heretics, but they respected sanctuary and shed far less blood than the city feared. Still, the psychological impact was incalculable. In Bethlehem, Jerome heard the news and broke down. "My voice sticks in my throat," he wrote. "The city which had taken the whole world is itself taken." Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, began writing The City of God, a monumental defense of Christianity against the charge that it had caused Rome's fall. He died in 430 as Vandal armies besieged his city. The Vandals, another Germanic tribe, had crossed the Rhine in 406, traversed Gaul and Spain, and crossed into Africa in 429. They captured Carthage 10 years later, establishing a kingdom that dominated the western Mediterranean. In 455, their king Genseric sailed for Italy. His fleet anchored off Ostia, and his army marched on undefended Rome. Pope Leo I met Genseric at the city gates. We do not know what he said. The chronicles record only that the Vandal king promised to spare the population and refrain from fire. He did not promise to spare the buildings. For 14 days, the Vandals systematically stripped Rome of its wealth. They removed the gold plating from the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. They carried off the menorah from the Temple of Peace, the spoils of Titus's Jewish war 7 centuries earlier. They dismantled the bronze roof of the Capitoline Temple. Thousands of captives were transported to Africa, including the Empress and her daughters. The Western Empire continued, after a fashion. Puppet emperors were installed and deposed by Germanic generals who controlled the army. Majorian, the last emperor who attempted serious reform, was assassinated in 461. Julius Nepos, the last emperor recognized by Constantinople, fled to Dalmatia in 475. And then, in 476, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the child Emperor Romulus Augustulus, the Little Augustus, whose name echoed the founder and mocked his impotence. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and proclaimed himself king of Italy. There was no great battle, no dramatic siege. The Roman Empire in the West simply ceased to be. The East, meanwhile, endured. Constantinople's walls, built by Theodosius II, were the strongest fortifications in the medieval world. Its emperors spoke Latin, then Greek, then exclusively Greek, but they still called themselves Romans. Their subjects, throughout the Balkans, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, were Romaoi, Romans. Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565, attempted to restore the old empire. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and southern Spain from the Visigoths. His jurists compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law that would influence European jurisprudence for a millennium. His architect built the Hagia Sophia, whose vast dome seemed to float on light, suspended from heaven by chains of gold. But Justinian's reconquests were fragile. Within 3 years of his death, the Lombards had invaded Italy, reducing Byzantine control to scattered enclaves. The Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival, pressed the eastern frontier. Plague depopulated the cities, and in the 7th century, a new power emerged from Arabia. The armies of Islam conquered Syria in 636, Egypt in 642, Carthage in 698. They swept across North Africa, crossed into Spain, and advanced into Gaul before Charles Martel turned them back at Tours in 732. The Mediterranean, once Rome's inland sea, became a Muslim lake. The Byzantine Empire shrank to the size of a regional state, its territory reduced to Anatolia and fragments of Greece and Italy. Constantinople survived, besieged twice by Arab armies, its walls proving as formidable as legend claimed. But the empire of Augustus and Trajan, of Constantine and Justinian, had become something new, a Greek Orthodox theocracy, gradually transformed into what historians would call Byzantium. In the West, the old Roman order dissolved. Trade contracted, cities emptied, literacy declined. The great aristocratic villas crumbled. The legions were gone. The roads they had built fell into disrepair. The aqueducts silted up and ceased to flow. Population declined, perhaps by as much as 50% in some regions. But Rome did not die. The popes, bishops of the ancient capital, gradually assumed the mantle of Roman authority. Pope Leo I had confronted Attila the Hun in 452 and persuaded him to turn back from Italy. Pope Gregory the Great, in the late 6th century, administered the city's grain supply, negotiated with the Lombard invaders, and sent missionaries to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons. When the emperor in Constantinople proved too distant and too weak to protect his Italian subjects, the papacy filled the vacuum. In 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as emperor of the Romans. The coronation was illegal. There could be only one Roman emperor, and he sat in Constantinople, but it was also irreversible. The idea of Rome, the claim to its legacy, had migrated northward, and still Rome endured. Through the centuries, the city shrank and decayed. The population that had once approached 1 million fell to perhaps 30,000. Sheep grazed in the Forum. The great monuments were quarried for building stone. The Colosseum stripped of its marble facings. The temples converted into churches or fortresses. The bronze roof of the Pantheon melted down and recast into cannons. But the Pantheon still stands, its dome still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. The Colosseum still rises above the city skyline, its damaged silhouette immediately recognizable. The aqueducts, though broken, still stride across the Campagna. The Tiber still flows, gentle and brown, beneath the bridges that bear the names of ancient emperors. Roman law, codified under Justinian, became the foundation of European legal systems. Roman language, the vulgar Latin spoken by soldiers and merchants, evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Roman letters, the alphabet we are using now, were adopted and adapted by every language of Western civilization. Roman roads still underlie modern highways. Roman military organization shaped the armies that would conquer and colonize the globe. Roman architecture, with its arches and vaults and domes, influenced builders from Brunelleschi to Thomas Jefferson. The Roman Senate, though dormant for centuries, lent its name and its symbolism to democratic assemblies around the world. In Roman history, the stories of Aeneas and Romulus, of Cincinnatus and Scipio, of Caesar and Augustus, continued to be told generation after generation. Schoolboys memorized the names of the 7 kings. Revolutionary leaders modeled themselves on Brutus. Dictators claimed the legacy of Caesar. Republics invoked the ghost of the Roman Republic. The Roman Empire never truly ended. It transformed, diffused, became something too vast and pervasive to be contained within political boundaries. The empire that conquered the world was itself conquered by its legacy. Now, as night settles around you and the weight of 2,000 years grows gentle in your mind, consider this. The Rome we have journeyed through tonight is not gone. It is not even past. Every time a judge instructs a jury, every time an architect designs a dome, every time a citizen votes in an election, every time a traveler follows a straight road toward an unseen horizon, Rome lives. The she-wolf still nurses her twins on the Capitoline Hill. The legions still march, though their armor has changed and their eagles have become flags. The Senate still debates, though its chambers are now called parliaments and congresses and assemblies. The eternal city has no walls, no borders, no single capital. It is an idea, a seed planted in the darkness of prehistory, watered by the blood of exiles and the milk of a wolf, and it has grown to encompass the world. Let the warmth of that legacy settle over you like a heavy cloak. Let the echo of marching feet fade into the gentle patter of rain against your window. Let the marble and the blood, the triumphs and the tragedies, the emperors and the slaves, recede into the comfortable distance of dream. The fire crackles softly, the night deepens, and somewhere, across the gulf of centuries, a soldier stands guard on Hadrian's wall. A farmer guides his plow through the volcanic soil of Campania. A mother whispers the story of Romulus and Remus to her sleeping child. The empire endures. Sleep now. Dream of 7 hills and a river that flows toward the sea. Dream of legions marching toward horizons they will never reach, and of the roads they built that will carry travelers for 2,000 years. Dream of a city that was not built in a day and will not fall in one. The eternal city waits, patient and vast, for you to return. And you will. All roads lead there. Good night.